Some truths lie buried not beneath the earth, but within the very files meant to protect them. This tale begins with a magistrate's death recorded as accident, yet whispered corruption, and a vanished servant point to something far darker. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Now, let us walk beside Holmes through the corridors of power, where secrets are written in silence and justice waits to be unmasked. It was in one of those rare intervals of tranquility, when London life afforded no striking incident and the criminal world seemed to slumber, that I found myself once more at Baker Street. Holmes had devoted himself with relentless energy to abstruse chemical experiments, filling our sitting room with pungent odours and curious flasks, while I amused myself with my medical journals and a volume of Thucydides, which had lain long neglected on my shelves. The days passed in a curious monotony, broken only by Holmes's occasional epigrams or a violin interlude when his mood turned reflective. It was at such a season that I noticed more than ever the peculiar restlessness of his nature when deprived of an intellectual stimulus. He would pace the room, smoke incessantly, and peer out into the grey murk of Baker Street, as though the fog itself might carry with it some mystery worth unravelling. For my part, I had resigned myself to a few uneventful weeks, grateful for the repose after our recent adventures. Yet I should have known that such calm could not endure. Events of the most singular and perilous character were already forming their shadow over our threshold, and before the week had ended, the serenity of our existence was rudely shattered by the arrival of a visitor whose very presence bore the weight of unspoken dread. It was towards the close of a damp, oppressive afternoon that Mrs. Hudson ushered into our rooms none other than Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard. I had often remarked upon his brisk manner and sharp, bird-like features, but on this occasion he appeared unusually grave, his lips drawn tight and his eyes betraying an unease that sat ill with his customary briskness. In his hands he bore a stout leather case, its lock fastened, which he placed upon our table as though it contained some noxious thing. Holmes, who had been sprawled languidly upon the sofa, rose with an alertness that betrayed his recognition of a matter of significance. He bowed slightly, his keen eyes already fixed upon the case. "You have the air, Lestrade, of a man who carries not only a burden but a secret," said Holmes, with that quiet incisiveness that never failed to unsettle his professional colleagues. Lestrade, instead of responding with his usual sharp retort, sank into the chair opposite me and passed a hand across his brow. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice lower than I had ever heard it, "I have brought you something which, if I am honest, I should have destroyed long ago. But circumstances, dark circumstances, have compelled me otherwise." Holmes motioned him on with a slight gesture of the hand, his expression one of calm expectancy, while I confess that a strange thrill of anticipation passed through me. Clearly, this was no common case. With a deliberate motion, Lestrade drew a key from his pocket, unlocked the case, and produced a thick folder bound in faded red twine. The edges of the papers were worn, as though handled often yet never with resolution. He laid it before Holmes, whose long fingers caressed the cover for an instant before untying the knot. "This file," said Lestrade, "concerns the death, some years past, of Sir Edmund Latimer, a magistrate of considerable standing. The verdict returned was that of accident. He was found lifeless in his study, the gas having escaped from a lamp left carelessly burning. All was written off as a tragic mishap. And yet—" He paused, his eyes flickering between us. "And yet the case lingers in your conscience," Holmes finished for him, his voice soft but penetrating. "Just so," replied the inspector, almost with relief. "There were inconsistencies, whispers even within the yard, but no man dared speak them aloud. Witness statements that conflicted, an autopsy that hinted at more than it declared, and above all, political pressures that pressed upon the inquiry with uncommon weight. I tell you, Holmes, from the first I doubted it, but I was powerless. The matter was closed." Holmes's eyes glittered as he turned a page, his nostrils slightly dilated in that subtle sign I had learned to recognize as excitement. I leaned closer, glimpsing faded ink, marginal notes, and one curious blot, as though a sentence had been abruptly expunged. "Accident indeed," Holmes murmured. "It is a poor sort of accident that leaves behind so many contradictions." As Lestrade continued, the air in our sitting room seemed to darken with the weight of what he disclosed. "I need not tell you, gentlemen," he said in a subdued tone, "that Sir Edmund's work on the bench had earned him both respect and bitter enemies. He was known for his integrity, and in certain quarters there were whispers of an inquiry he intended to pursue, an inquiry into bribery at the very heart of our civic institutions." Holmes tapped the folder lightly. "And these papers contain traces of such whispers, though muted and distorted, I warrant." Lestrade inclined his head gravely. "Certain statements vanished before the file was sealed, others were amended. I could not say by whose authority, but the absence of Sir Edmund's personal journal, known to exist, has always troubled me. Without it, the truth was buried." The inspector's words hung in the room like smoke, suggestive of forces too powerful for ordinary justice. I confess that a chill ran through me, for I perceived in this disclosure not merely a mystery of death, but the shadow of corruption stretching its unseen hand over all. At last, Lestrade leaned forward, his hand trembling slightly as he pressed it upon the folder. "I had thought the matter dead and done," he said, "until within these past days inquiries have been made, strange inquiries, by persons whose interest in the case alarms me. They seek knowledge of this file, and I fear not only for my position at the yard, but for my very safety." Holmes regarded him intently. "Then, Inspector, it is not merely the past that troubles you. The shadow lengthens into the present." "Exactly so," Lestrade admitted. "I know not what designs are afoot, but if Sir Edmund was silenced for probing too deeply, what hope have I should these men decide I am an obstacle? You are the only one I could turn to, Mr. Holmes. Scotland Yard cannot shield me from its own unseen hand." Holmes closed the folder and set it aside with deliberate care. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, but edged with steel. "You were right to come, Lestrade, for if indeed corruption lies at the root, then the truth must be unearthed before it consumes us all." Thus was the curtain lifted on one of the most perilous cases in my chronicles. Holmes took the dossier from Lestrade with that air of suppressed eagerness which I had so often remarked when some intellectual problem was laid before him. He spread the papers across our table, his long, nervous fingers hovering lightly above them, as his keen grey eyes darted from line to line. For several minutes there was silence, broken only by the faint crackle of the pages as he turned them. I, who had often witnessed his powers of concentration, found myself leaning over his shoulder in fascination, though my own eye could make little sense of the scattered depositions and medical reports. "Contradiction upon contradiction," he muttered at last. "Here a witness swears he saw Sir Edmund seated by his desk a half-hour before the discovery, while another maintains he was absent from the room. The physician's notes speak of congestion consistent with gas inhalation, and yet there are markings upon the neck described in a curiously evasive fashion. Do you perceive, Watson, how the truth peeps forth even through the veil of ambiguity?" I admitted frankly that I did not. "Observe also," Holmes continued, "that a certain photograph, mentioned by two witnesses, appears nowhere in this file. Why should a document be retained in memory, yet absent in evidence? Such omissions are the fingerprints of interference." Lestrade shifted uneasily in his chair. "I always suspected," said he, but without proof, I was silenced. Holmes looked up with sudden intensity. "Then proof we must seek, and quickly, for the hand that has once tampered with justice will strike again if threatened." The detective pushed aside the papers, rose, and with a quick glance at Lestrade declared, "Come, we must test the veracity of those still living who touch this case. Let us begin with the clerk whose testimony was most curtailed. That same evening found us in a narrow lane off Holborn, where the surviving clerk, one James Fenton, resided in modest lodgings above a stationer's shop. The man received us with evident reluctance, his face pale and his hands trembling as he fumbled with the lamp. Lestrade announced our errand in his curt fashion, but it was Holmes's steady gaze that drew forth the truth. "You testified, did you not?" Holmes began, "that you prepared documents for Sir Edmund in the week before his death?" Yes, sir," the man stammered, though I scarce recall the details. It was years ago. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "And yet memory returns most vividly when coloured by fear. Tell us, Mr. Fenton, whose orders restrained your tongue at the inquest?" The clerk started violently. I said nothing of the kind." Holmes leaned forward. "On the contrary, you said less than nothing. You omitted reference to a private ledger you carried from Sir Edmund's study on the very day before his death. Why was that, Mr. Fenton?" The poor fellow sank into his chair, beads of perspiration standing on his brow. "I was told to keep silent. There were men, gentlemen, men above me. They said it was dangerous to speak. Orders from above, they called it." Lestrade uttered a sharp exclamation, but Holmes held up his hand. "And these orders, were they written, spoken, or implied?" "Spoken, sir," whispered Fenton. "A visitor from the yard came himself, said I had best forget I ever carried the book. I have lived in dread ever since." I confess that a chill ran through me at these words, for they confirmed in the plainest manner what Holmes had already suggested, that the roots of this business stretched into the very soil of authority. Holmes, however, betrayed no outward sign of surprise. "You have done wisely to speak now," he said gravely, "for silence may shelter you for a season, but truth alone affords lasting protection. We shall trouble you no more, Mr. Fenton, but know this, the shadows that governed your fear shall presently be brought into the light." With that, Holmes rose, his face set in that expression of austere determination which I had come to associate with the gravest perils. I followed in silence, my thoughts heavy with foreboding, for I perceived that we were embarked upon a case where the enemy was no mere criminal, but the unseen hand of corruption itself. We quitted the clerk's lodgings in silence, the evening fog pressing heavily upon us as though to echo the weight of what we had heard. Lestrade muttered something about returning at once to the yard, but Holmes checked him with a gesture. "There is more to glean from what lies within the file itself," said he, as he beckoned us into a nearby coffee-house, where under the dim light of an oil lamp he spread several of the papers upon the table. His finger alighted upon a memorandum from one of the attending constables. "Do you observe this?" he asked, pointing to the margin where a faint scrawl had been made, almost erased, yet still visible. It resembled not words, but a curious mark, half circle and bar, repeated with mechanical exactness. I admitted it conveyed nothing to my eye. Holmes smiled thinly. "Yet it appears not once, but thrice, here, upon this memorandum, again in the deposition of a servant, and lastly, in a rubbing taken from Sir Edmund's own blotter. What say you to that, Lestrade?" The inspector peered closely, frowning. "A mere doodle, no doubt." Holmes shook his head. "A man may doodle idly, but he does not reproduce the same character in 3 separate documents without design. It is the private cipher, or at least the sign, of some association, and mark you, its presence both in official notes and upon the magistrate's desk proves that his hand and theirs were brought dangerously close." I felt a thrill at the words, for it seemed we had stumbled upon a secret emblem of conspiracy. Holmes folded the documents with deliberate care. "Symbols, Watson," he said, "are the footprints of the unseen. They betray allegiance even when all words are silenced." We emerged once more into the clammy night, and as we walked, Holmes maintained that absorbed silence which signalled the wheels of his mind turning with swift precision. Lestrade, evidently restless under the weight of his own thoughts, at last broke forth. "You put more faith in a scrawl than I should in a sworn testimony, Mr. Holmes. If it were a sign, what does it tell us? Holmes's lips curved in that enigmatic smile I knew so well. It tells us, Inspector, that Sir Edmund's death was neither random nor the act of a solitary hand. It tells us also that those who sought to suppress the truth had left their own calling card upon the very instruments of justice. For my part, I ventured, it seems incredible that such a thing should pass unnoticed. On the contrary, replied Holmes, it passed unnoticed because it was meant to be unnoticed. The common eye disregards what it cannot read. But to those who know, such a mark is louder than a proclamation. He paused, his gaze lost in the drifting vapours of the street lamps. Then, in a tone almost to himself, he uttered, "The hand that writes in the shadows often leaves the boldest mark." The phrase struck me with a peculiar chill, as though he had voiced some prophecy. Lestrade gave a short laugh, but there was little mirth in it. "If you are right, Holmes, then we are facing men who do not scruple to leave corpses behind them." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "And therefore we must tread with double care. Their very boldness will betray them in time, but only if we follow where the traces lead." As we returned to Baker Street, I could not shake the image of that mysterious symbol, lurking like a stain across the pages, of justice, nor Holmes's sombre reflection, which echoed in my mind long after we had reached the warmth of our chambers. Little did I know how swiftly those words would prove themselves, and how perilous the road ahead would become. It was on the following morning that Holmes directed our steps towards Lincoln's Inn, where Mr. Gerald Markham, a barrister of some notoriety, maintained his chambers. His name had been mentioned in the file more than once, and Lestrade, with his characteristic directness, declared him a likely adversary of Sir Edmund. "They quarrelled openly in court," said he. "Markham was censured for his conduct, and Sir Edmund was the hand that struck the blow. If any man had cause to wish him gone, it was he." We were admitted after some delay, and found Mr. Markham to be a tall, florid man, whose confident bearing seemed only heightened by the presence of the law books surrounding him. He greeted us with civility, though I detected a flash of irritation in his eye when Sir Edmund's name was uttered. "You suspect me," he said with a disdainful laugh. "Why, gentlemen, at the hour of the magistrate's death I was in Brighton, in company too well known to be doubted. My engagements can be verified to the minute." Holmes regarded him steadily. "Your alibi is indeed formidable," said he, "and yet hostility leaves traces even when the deed itself is impossible. Tell me, Mr. Markham, have you ever seen this symbol?" He produced the memorandum with the half-circle and bar. The barrister started perceptibly, though he recovered at once. "A mere scribble," he said. "I cannot say I have ever remarked upon it." We departed soon after, Lestrade muttering that the man's guilt was plain. But Holmes shook his head. "He had reason to hate," said he, "but not the opportunity. And yet, did you note, Watson, how his composure faltered at sight of the mark? He is no murderer, but he knows more of this matter than he dared admit." That afternoon, we proceeded to Sir Edmund Latimer's residence, a sombre house still kept by distant relations. Through Lestrade's authority, we were admitted to the late magistrate's study, a chamber preserved much as it had stood on the fatal night. Holmes moved slowly about the room, his eyes darting from corner to corner, pausing at intervals to kneel and scrutinize some trivial detail, invisible to others. At length, he pointed to a darkened patch upon the rug before the desk. "Note this scorch, Watson. The records state that the gas was the cause of death, yet here is proof of flame, perhaps from the burning of papers. Something was destroyed here with haste." He next turned to a drawer of the great mahogany desk, which resisted his pull. With some effort he wrenched it open, revealing splintered wood where a lock had been forced. A search was made, and not by burglars. The hand that prized this open knew well what it sought. Lastly, he turned to the shelves. "There is mention of a personal journal kept daily by Sir Edmund. Do you perceive it, Watson?" I glanced along the rows. There are ledgers, reports, and letters, but no journal. Just so. That absence is more eloquent than presence. Someone desired that book, and they have it now. I could not suppress a shiver as I looked upon the room, still echoing with the magistrate's unseen presence. Holmes stood at the hearth, his profile set against the dim light. The fire was quenched, he said softly, but the ashes yet retain their heat. We must be swift, Watson, for the trail grows colder with each passing hour. It was late that evening when a hurried knock summoned Holmes and me to Lestrade's modest lodgings near Charing Cross. We found the inspector pale and visibly shaken, clutching a slip of paper in his hand. Without a word, he thrust it towards us. The message, scrawled in uneven characters upon coarse paper, bore but a single sentence. "Let the dead rest, Inspector, or join them." Lestrade's voice trembled as he spoke. "It was thrust under my door not an hour ago. No one was seen. The porter swears he noticed nothing. I have been followed, Mr. Holmes. I feel it in my bones." Holmes examined the note carefully, holding it close to the lamp. "The hand is disguised," he observed. "Note the unnatural spacing between the words. Yet the ink is recent, and the folds suggest it was carried some time in a pocket before delivery. The writer is cautious, but not beyond detection." "This is intimidation of the worst sort," Lestrade exclaimed bitterly. "I knew we were stirring dangerous waters, but to threaten me in my own lodgings." Holmes interrupted him with quiet firmness. "On the contrary, Inspector, it proves we are drawing close. The enemy would not trouble with threats unless he feared discovery. For my own part, I confess that the menace of the words sent a chill through me. It was a stark reminder that this was no ordinary inquiry, but one in which men of ruthless determination would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. The following morning found me in a state of perplexity greater than I can readily recall from any of our former adventures. The contradictions multiplied with each discovery: a barrister with motive but no opportunity, a study that hinted at destruction yet yielded no tangible evidence, a clerk intimidated into silence, and now a letter of menace aimed directly at the man charged with law's enforcement. I confessed my bewilderment to Holmes as we took our breakfast in Baker Street. "My dear fellow," I said, "I cannot make sense of these fragments. Every clue seems to point in a different direction, and each explanation is contradicted by the next. I can scarcely distinguish shadow from substance." Holmes regarded me with that serene composure which was his most exasperating quality when I floundered amidst complexities. "You see too many trees, Watson, and thus the forest escapes you. This case reeks not of accident, but of orchestration. Every apparent contradiction is but another thread in the same fabric. It is a tapestry woven deliberately to deceive." "And yet," I pressed, "to what end? Who could profit by so intricate a scheme?" Holmes only smiled faintly. "That, my dear fellow, is what we are soon to learn. Be patient. The fog obscures much, but it also reveals where the light falls." I fell silent, chastened, but not comforted. For the first time, I began to sense that we were in pursuit not merely of an individual crime, but of some larger, darker design. Later that day, as Holmes once more pored over the file, he paused at a deposition I had hitherto overlooked. It concerned Samuel Briggs, Sir Edmund's manservant of many years. The statement described him as loyal, diligent, and of unimpeachable character. Yet beyond that brief note, the file was silent. "Curious," Holmes remarked. "The magistrate's closest attendant, the man who would know his habits best, yet his voice is scarcely heard. Tell me, Lestrade, what became of this Briggs after Sir Edmund's death?" The inspector frowned. "That is the strange part, Mr. Holmes. He vanished, resigned his position, so it was said, and left London. But no address was ever given, nor has he been heard of since." Holmes's eyes narrowed. A disappearance too neat, too timely. If he was silenced, then it is proof positive that the matter reached beyond mere mischance. If he absented himself willingly, it was because he feared exposure. I could not help but exclaim, "But surely, Holmes, his absence is but coincidence. Servants often change situations." "Coincidence, Watson, is the word employed when one lacks imagination. Depend upon it, this man's fate is interwoven with the magistrate's end. Find Briggs, and we shall draw near the heart of the conspiracy." Holmes spoke with such conviction that even Lestrade's habitual scepticism seemed shaken. I saw in the inspector's eyes the dawning recognition that we were embarked upon a contest against forces far more dangerous than any individual criminal he had ever pursued. It was 2 days later, after inquiries pursued with Holmes's characteristic thoroughness, that we at last traced the missing servant, Samuel Briggs, to a mean lodging house in the squalid quarter of Suffolk. The place reeked of damp and decay, and its wretched proprietor led us up a crooked stair with evident reluctance. "He took the room last week," the man muttered, "paid in advance, kept much to himself." When at length the door was forced, a ghastly sight met our eyes. The poor fellow lay suspended from a beam, his body swaying slightly in the draught that entered as the door opened. A chair had been overturned beneath him, and upon the table beside it was scrawled a note of farewell in a trembling hand. The scene had all the appearance of suicide, yet there was something in its very completeness that struck me as artificial, as though arranged for the gaze of strangers. Lestrade muttered an oath under his breath. "So that ends our last witness," said he bitterly. Holmes, however, betrayed no emotion. He moved slowly about the room, his gaze alighting on every detail: the fibres of the rope, the overturned chair, the ink still moist upon the farewell note. I had learned to fear that silence more than his most cutting words, for it heralded conclusions to which the rest of us were blind. "Suicide?" I ventured at last. Holmes shook his head gravely. "We shall see, Watson. But if so, it is suicide written to order." Holmes bade Lestrade cut down the body, and with his own hands he examined the ligature with minute care. "Observe, Watson," he said quietly. "The rope is drawn tightly from left to right, yet Briggs was right-handed. To produce such a tension unaided would require an awkward contortion. Moreover, the knot is placed behind the ear, not beneath the chin, where the weight of the body would naturally drag it." I looked more closely and saw that he was indeed correct. The angle was unnatural, and the pressure mark upon the skin suggested a force exerted by another hand. "Then it is murder?" I whispered. "Beyond question," Holmes replied. "The farewell note, too, betrays artifice. The hand trembles, yes, but not with despair. It trembles with disguise. Briggs did not pen these lines of his own free will." Lestrade uttered a groan. "Then we are dealing with men who strike swiftly and leave no witness behind." Holmes folded the note carefully and placed it in his pocket. "On the contrary, Inspector, they have left us a witness more eloquent than any man, the evidence of their own clumsy thoroughness. They staged this scene to silence Briggs, but in so doing revealed that which no true suicide could contrive. The more they conceal, the more they betray." Once we had quitted that melancholy lodging-house, Holmes walked with swift, purposeful strides, his brows knitted in thought. At last, when we were seated again in Baker Street, he spread before him both the file and the meagre notes he had made from Briggs's effects. "Consider, Watson, the pattern that emerges," he said. "Sir Edmund was poised to expose financial irregularities implicating certain interests. That his manservant perished in so contrived a manner proves those interests extend to silencing even the humblest voice. Now, who stood to gain from such suppression?" He drew out 2 names, pencilled in a margin of one deposition, but never cited at the inquest. The first belonged to a senior officer of the Yard, a man of spotless public reputation, but whose hand, Holmes suggested, had brushed too closely against clandestine matters. The second was a financier of vast influence, whose dealings with certain contractors were rumoured, though never proved, to be tainted with corruption. You perceive, Watson, how magistrate, servant, and file are bound together in a chain of secrecy. Break one link, and the whole structure totters. Lestrade, pale and unsettled, muttered, "If this is true, then we are up against men whose power reaches into the highest places." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "That is precisely why Briggs's end was disguised as self-destruction. Nothing so alarms the guilty as the prospect of testimony." As I listened to Holmes set forth his reasoning, a profound unease crept upon me. I had faced peril before in his company: footpads in dark alleys, cold-blooded murderers, even the Hound of Dartmoor, but never had I felt the weight of an enemy so intangible and vast. "This is no longer," I said slowly, "the pursuit of a single murderer, nor even of a cabal bent on vengeance. Holmes, we are meddling with forces that shape the very instruments of law and finance. How can we, three men, hope to withstand them?" Holmes gave me a searching glance, and though his face betrayed no fear, I thought I saw the shadow of care in his eyes. "My dear Watson," he replied, "your apprehension does you credit. It is well that you perceive the magnitude of what lies before us, for forewarned is forearmed. Yet do not mistake me. We fight not with strength, but with knowledge, and it is precisely knowledge that our adversaries most dread." His calmness reassured me somewhat, but the heaviness remained. For the first time, I understood that our investigation was not merely an intellectual exercise, but a step into a labyrinth where the very walls closed in with danger. Holmes rose and stood by the window, gazing out upon the flickering lamps of Baker Street, his profile set in deep thought. At length he spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "We tread on quicksand, Watson. The deeper we sink, the greater the peril. Yet remember, even the most treacherous bog has its firm patches. If only one knows where to place the foot, our task is to discover those patches and tread upon them with certainty." I asked him whether he truly believed our enemies would strike at us as they had at Briggs. He turned to me with that piercing gaze. "I knew so. Well, I do not merely believe it, I count upon it. Their strength lies in secrecy, and when secrecy is threatened, desperation follows. We must therefore proceed with utmost caution, yet also with resolution. For every step we take forward compels them into rashness, and therein lies their ruin." Lestrade, who had been silent, gave a nervous laugh. "Well, Mr. Holmes, I dare say I never thought to find myself wading through such depths, but if you lead, I'll follow." Holmes inclined his head gravely. "Then steel yourself, Inspector, for the battle is not yet joined, but the field is already chosen." His words lingered with me long after, a solemn warning that the true contest was only beginning. For 2 days, Holmes scarcely stirred from our rooms, save to send hurried notes to various contacts whose names he never disclosed. I watched with mingled curiosity and unease as he bent over our table, the magistrate's file spread before him, and a sheaf of blank foolscap by his side. With quill and ink, he laboured with a diligence I had rarely witnessed, pausing only to hold a page at arm's length and compare it with some document from the bundle. "You perceive, Watson," he explained, "that official records carry a signature no less distinctive than handwriting. The watermark of paper, the tone of ink, the very flourish of the clerk's hand, all must be imitated with such precision that the counterfeit passes for truth." At length he laid down his pen, his eyes glinting with quiet triumph. "Behold," he said, "the missing memorandum. It is, of course, but my invention, a record of Sir Edmund's intention to bring his findings before the Home Office. In it, I have hinted at names that certain men would give much to keep concealed. This, my dear fellow, will serve as bait." "But Holmes," I protested, "to forge a document, even for so just a cause." He silenced me with a raised hand. "The morality of the stratagem is not our present concern. The end is to draw from their lair those who have too long wrapped themselves in darkness. Mark me, the guilty will reveal themselves by the eagerness with which they clutch at the snare." The plan, as he outlined it, was as daring as it was perilous. Through channels known only to himself, the memorandum would be allowed to fall into hands certain to pass it upward to the very men whose secrets it imperilled. Once they believed such a record existed, Their fear would compel them to act, and in that act, Holmes intended to unmask them. I could not but marvel at his audacity, though a chill passed over me as I realized the danger to which he exposed not only himself, but Lestrade and me as well. For if the men we pursued were indeed of such power and ruthlessness, they would stop short of nothing when cornered. Holmes seemed to divine my thought, for he gave a slight smile. "Courage, Watson. The fish is hooked. Now we must but play the line until the moment comes to land him." It was near midnight when, at Holmes's direction, we made our way to a deserted warehouse upon the Thames. The fog lay heavy upon the river, and the lapping of the water against the pilings mingled with the distant creak of a ship's rigging. Lestrade, though outwardly resolute, shifted restlessly beside me, his hand never far from the pocket where he carried his revolver. Holmes, calm as ever, had chosen our vantage with care. From a shadowed alcove, we could survey the interior through a gap in the boards. A single lantern burned within, casting long, wavering beams across the bare floor. Presently, we heard the tread of approaching feet, muffled yet hurried, and 3 figures slipped into the warehouse. "They have taken the bait," Holmes whispered. "Observe, Watson, the eagerness with which they consult the paper. That is guilt incarnate." One of the newcomers, a man of commanding stature, spread the forged memorandum upon a crate, while the others bent over it with anxious eyes. Though I could not hear their words distinctly, their gestures betrayed agitation. Twice the tallest among them struck the wood angrily with his fist, while another pointed towards the door as though urging immediate action. Holmes's hand closed lightly upon my arm. "Steady," he murmured. "The moment ripens, but the fruit must fall of its own weight." Minutes passed with agonizing slowness. At last the tallest figure straightened, and the lantern's glow revealed features I recognized from caricatures in the illustrated press. An eminent judge, noted for his stern pronouncements from the bench. That he should be here, consorting with shadowy companions over so damning a document, filled me with a sense of shock that words cannot convey. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes shining with the light of triumph. "There, Watson," he breathed, "is the spider at the centre of the web, and presently, when the threads tighten, he shall find himself trapped within his own device." The lantern light flared across the tall man's face, and in that instant the veil was lifted. I recognized him at once, for I had seen his likeness in more than one illustrated journal, none other than Sir Reginald Dunham, a judge whose stern countenance and reputation for merciless sentences had long commanded both respect and dread. That such a figure, exalted upon the bench, should be found in a midnight conference within a deserted warehouse was in itself enough to condemn him. But the agitation with which he handled the spurious memorandum left no room for doubt. His lips moved rapidly, issuing sharp instructions to the 2 shadowy companions who flanked him, while his hand trembled as he struck the paper with his finger. Beside me, Lestrade gave a sharp intake of breath. "Good Lord, Holmes, it is Dunham himself," he whispered hoarsely. Holmes's hand restrained him. "Patience, Inspector. Let the fish gorge before we draw the net." We watched in silence as the judge folded the paper with evident care, slipping it into the breast of his coat. His entire demeanour betrayed the fear of a man who knows his own downfall lies within reach. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "There, Watson, stands the architect of Latimer's death. It was he who quashed the investigation, he who contrived the disappearance of the journal, and he who silenced the servant. His presence here is confession writ large." My heart pounded as I looked upon the man, so powerful in daylight, now reduced to furtive dealings in shadow. The contrast between the dignity of his office and the degradation of his secret meeting filled me with mingled horror and fascination. I understood then the full daring of Holmes's stratagem, for only by luring so great a man into exposure could the truth ever be dragged into the light. At a signal from Holmes, we stepped forth from our concealment. The echo of our boots upon the boards caused the three men to start as though struck by a thunderclap. Sir Reginald spun round, his face draining of colour as Holmes advanced with the calm precision of a surgeon approaching his patient. "Your lordship," Holmes said evenly, "it is not often that justice must be pursued beyond the bench upon which you sit. Yet here, in this place, you stand condemned by your own conduct." Dunham stammered something about intrusion, but Holmes cut him short, his voice rising with quiet authority. "The burn mark upon Latimer's rug, the missing journal spirited away, the servant found murdered under guise of suicide, each is a thread, and together they weave a tapestry whose pattern is unmistakable. And now this memorandum, false though it be, has drawn you to it as surely as a moth to flame." The judge's hands shook as he clutched his coat. His companions shrank into the shadows, leaving him alone beneath Holmes's relentless gaze. For a moment I feared the man might draw a weapon, so fierce was the struggle that contorted his features. Holmes pressed on. "Confess it, sir. You silenced Latimer to shield your corruption, and you stifled the voices that might expose you. The law you pretended to serve you have perverted for your own ends. Speak if you dare, though your silence will condemn you no less." The man swayed as though the very weight of truth bore him down. His lips moved, but no sound came. In that charged silence, the fall of a pin might have resounded like a pistol shot. It was then that Lestrade, with a steadiness I had seldom seen in him, stepped forward from our side. His voice, though firm, carried the weight of long years overshadowed by the authority of men such as Dunham. "Sir Reginald Dunham," he said, "I arrest you in the name of the law." For a heartbeat the judge stood rigid, his eyes darting wildly as though seeking escape. But the fight was gone from him. His shoulders sagged, and he uttered a groan that was half defiance, half despair. Lestrade slipped the irons upon his wrists with a composure that surprised me, and in that moment it seemed to me that the inspector, so often the butt of Holmes's sharp criticisms, rose to his full stature as an officer of justice. Holmes inclined his head gravely. "Well done, Inspector. You have reclaimed the dignity of your office against the very man who would have debased it." Lestrade's face, though pale, betrayed a flicker of pride. "I never thought, Mr. Holmes, to stand thus over one who once commanded my obedience. But justice must be blind to rank, and if ever proof of it were needed, it is here tonight." As we led our prisoner out into the fog-laden air, I reflected upon the extraordinary reversal of fortune. A judge unmasked as criminal, an inspector vindicated, and Holmes's genius triumphant once more. Yet I could not escape the foreboding sense that, though the man was taken, the forces behind him still cast their shadow over us. The following morning, in the quiet of Baker Street, Holmes consented at last to unfold the tangled skein whose threads he had so masterfully disentangled. Lestrade sat with us, weary from a sleepless night, yet eager to hear the reasoning which had laid bare corruption in so exalted a place. "You will recall, Watson," Holmes began, "that my suspicions were first stirred by contradictions within the magistrate's file. Witness statements clashed in particulars of time, while the medical report hinted at violence yet shrank from naming it. Such evasions suggested interference. The burn mark upon Latimer's rug was the second thread. It bespoke not accident, but the hurried destruction of a ledger. That ledger, I am convinced, contained proof of illicit payments made by contractors to men in positions of trust." Holmes leaned back, his eyes gleaming. The missing journal was the third and most damning absence. Sir Edmund kept a meticulous record of his dealings. That it vanished after his death, while all else remained, proved deliberate removal. Who but those threatened by exposure would dare suppress it? "As for the servant Briggs," Holmes continued, "his disappearance was too opportune to be chance. When we traced him, the staging of his death betrayed the hand of murder. The position of the knot alone sufficed to prove it, but the counterfeit farewell confirmed that another had guided his pen. Thus the conspiracy silenced one who might have testified to the theft of the journal. He drew forth the paper with the curious symbol. Lastly, this mark, the cipher of a circle and bar, was their fatal vanity. Found in both official memoranda and upon Latimer's blotter, it betrayed a circle of influence spanning the bench and the yard itself. By forging a memorandum implicating them, I knew the guilty would rush to seize it. Their eagerness was their undoing, and so the judge himself stepped into the trap. Lestrade gave a low whistle, while I marvelled once more at the relentless clarity with which Holmes traced each clue to its rightful place. As I listened, a profound sense of awe and relief swept over me. It seemed almost miraculous that we had come so near to leaving the truth forever buried. Had Holmes not pierced the veil of contradiction, the magistrate's death would have passed into history as a mere mishap, the servant's as a coward's end, and the emblem as a meaningless scrawl. I shuddered to think how narrowly justice had escaped suffocation beneath the weight of secrecy, for every witness had been silenced, every document tampered with, and even Lestrade himself threatened into silence. Only Holmes's unflinching pursuit of the smallest detail had prevented the triumph of corruption. "You see, Watson," Holmes remarked as though reading my thoughts, "truth may be concealed for a time, but it cannot be extinguished. The flame may flicker, yet a single breath will revive it, if one but knows where to look." His words struck me deeply, for I realized that courage alone would not have sufficed in this contest. It was intellect allied with perseverance, the faculty to discern meaning in what others dismissed, that had delivered us. Without Holmes, I doubt not that the conspiracy would have triumphed utterly. It was then that Lestrade, usually so guarded in Holmes's presence, spoke with an earnestness I had never before observed. "Mr. Holmes," said he, "I confess freely that in the past I have often resented your interference in police affairs, but tonight I stand corrected. Without your insight, not only would Latimer's death have remained unsolved, but I myself should have carried to my grave the suspicion of cowardice for failing to act upon my doubts. You have not only saved my honour, but restored my faith in the very justice I serve." Holmes inclined his head gravely, but his tone was without triumph. "Inspector, you undervalue your own share. It was your courage in preserving the file, though you might well have destroyed it, which made all else possible. That act required a fortitude greater than my deductions." Lestrade coloured slightly, yet his eyes shone with a pride I had seldom seen. "All the same, Mr. Holmes, I am in your debt. You have taught me that no rank is above scrutiny, and that law must be blind not only to the low, but to the exalted." Holmes waved the compliment aside, but I knew he valued such words more than he would ever confess. When Lestrade had departed, Holmes remained long at the window, his gaze fixed upon the drifting smoke that curled above the city's chimneys. At last he spoke, more to himself than to me. "Consider it, Watson. A judge sworn to dispense justice turns conspirator. A police official sworn to uphold the law becomes its betrayer, and men entrusted with honour sell it for gold. It is not the malefactor in the alley nor the cracksman on the rooftop that most endangers society, but the rot that creeps unseen within its very pillars." I ventured to reply that at least justice had prevailed in this instance. Holmes gave a faint smile, though his eyes remained sombre. "Yes, for now. But remember this. The gravest secrets are not those in the hands of criminals, but those concealed by those sworn to uphold the law. Against such foes, vigilance must be unceasing, for they strike from shadows deeper than any night." He turned then, his expression softened. "Come, Watson. The world will continue to spin its web of intrigue, and we must be ready when next it ensnares the unwary. Meanwhile, there remains tobacco, and perhaps a game of chess to pass the evening." Thus ended one of the darkest yet most illuminating cases in my chronicles, and as I set down my pen, I felt anew that peculiar mixture of awe and gratitude which every adventure with Sherlock Holmes awakened in me, a recognition that where others saw only confusion, he discerned the line of truth as clearly as though It had been etched in fire across the night. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled, eyes half closed in thought. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, "it was not the common criminal who endangered society here, but the man robed in authority. A petty thief may steal a purse, but when justice itself is corrupted, an entire nation trembles. That is why the smallest inconsistency must never be ignored, for therein lies the key to the gravest of truths. And so I leave you with this question. What do you believe was the judge's greatest error? His ambition, his secrecy, or his underestimation of Holmes? Share your thoughts below, and if you enjoyed this case, do subscribe for more mysteries of deduction and share this tale with those who would walk with us once more through the shadows of Baker Street.